The easiest and fastest way to create a class in Kotlin is just to create a new file, name it class, select class, and we've created our class. Now, much like other object-oriented programming languages, in Kotlin, classes can have members, and these members can be either properties or functions. There's no such concept as fields as such in Kotlin. When I want to create a property, much the same way, I can create it either mutable or immutable, similar to variables. So for instance, I could say val id is of type int and initialize that to 0. Now by default, Kotlin properties are internal. What that means is that they're accessible to the same module. If we want to make them public, we just add the public modifier. Also important to note that I can avoid having to explicitly define the type for the property. However, if I make this property public, I do have to put the type explicitly. So if I write public, now the compiler complains saying that you need to explicitly type this. Why? Because it's so much easier to change this to be an int to a string, for instance, when you don't have the type explicitly defined. And what we don't want to do is change types on public APIs. So I would have to define this as int and set it to 0. Now, if I want to make it mutable, I would then do var, for instance, name string equals empty. If I want to create a function, I would just write it much the same way as we do standalone, the code inside, and there you go. If I want to consume a class, let's just create a main function, for instance, here. I can just declare a variable of that class. And notice that there is no new keyword. So in Kotlin, you don't need the new. And now I can just call whatever I want on it. So here what we're doing is using a parameterless constructor, which is the default constructor in Kotlin. Now, if we want to pass in parameters to the constructor, what we do is declare them on the same line as where the class name is defined. So let's say, for instance, I want to pass in an email, then I could just say email string, and of course I could pass in default values as well if I so wanted to. So this allows us to have a single constructor, and passing in different parameters with default values would provide us with kind of like the overloaded constructors that we have in other languages. So here now it's complaining that I need to pass in a value for email. Now let's assume that I want to, for instance, pass in an ID, which is very common. So let's say that I want to pass in an ID instead of an email and make that int. And I want to assign this ID to the value of ID. So in principle, what we could try to do is just say ID val ID equals customer ID. And you can see that just like that, that pretty much works. Now, if I want to perform some checks or do some additional work in the constructor, what I can do is just create a new block using the braces, and inside there, do any constructor initialization work that I want. So for example, I could do some checks, or I can log some output here when the customer is created, for instance. Now, this kind of initialization whereby I'm passing in a value and then I'm assigning it to a property is very common, and we don't have to make it so verbose. In Kotlin, we can actually define this much easier. Create a new class, let's call this one employee, and we can define properties directly on the constructor. So I can say val id is int, val name equals string. And now what happens is that I'm defining a new class that has two properties that are immutable. One is ID, another one is name. So much the same way I could do here var employee and pass in, for example, 1 and call him John Smith. And from here I have access to the different properties of the employee.